Good morning once again. My name is Pastor Todd, and I am so thrilled to just continue this series. We're actually closing out this Peace of Mind series, and definitely looking forward to celebrating Derek Palooza next week. But this week, we are finishing out this series, and it's just been a great time. Hopefully for you, it's been, I know it has been for me, just a moment to just be blunt and honest about some of the struggles we can go through in life, and not just provide easy answers, but answers that draw us closer to Jesus, draw us into the true healer and provider, which is our Savior. But I just want to start off today with asking this one question. Have you ever had a season of life that ended a way that you didn't expect? Anybody? Yep. I think there's so many jokes out there about having plans and God's plans and how those all work out, right? Well, one of those is really for my wife and my family, the first season coming out of college. We grew up in Indiana, went to college in Indiana, and God called us to move to Florida to be a part of a church plant. And for us, that was Overflow, and God called us to be a part of kind of a house church or micro church, even before it was popular, and yet we were in that journey. So that created an opportunity for me to be a part of a pastoral team, but also work bivocationally. And so for me, to provide for my family, I actually worked for a dish installation company. And so dish satellites they put up on your house and all that stuff. It was a great company, great people to work for. I loved doing that. But when we moved here, and as seasons kind of go, right, things change pretty quickly, right? And so before I knew it, my oldest daughter, Ellie, was born. And so that was awesome. We bought a house, and then our church plant didn't quite go the way we anticipated, and so we actually merged with another Wesleyan church, and it was a great thing. But I ended up in my role within the church, was working, my wife and I, in the children's ministry. And children's ministry is something I can do. I'm one of those guys that can get excited about anything, but working with kids is something that is more draining than life-giving for me. Anybody else with me on that one? That's why we are so thankful for Pastor Caitlin and our volunteers who are just called into that ministry. But for me, that turned into a very draining ministry for me. And then, as many of you guys hopefully have experienced, but for me, in my professional life, I actually got to experience a couple promotions, and I grew. I eventually began to manage 2 departments. And so for me, that was damages and dispatching. And so in our company, no one liked me because you came to me when you broke something or when you didn't like where we sent you somewhere in the state of Florida. And so it was a stressful job, and I inherited the wonderful gift of a company cell phone, a company laptop, and a company hotspot, so I always could do work, right? Anybody have those seasons where it's a great just compliment to get that, and yet you realize you're not working 40 hours, you're not working 60 hours, you're just always working. At some point, low-grade working in the back of your mind, no matter what's going on. Well, for me, it's one of those seasons that what I realized is as I began to function in both of those areas, and for me, I got to confess, even as a pastor, my spiritual life was not in a mature state. And so I was not, as the busyness, as the stress of life, it began to overcrowd my spiritual life to the point when everything began to just suck my life to the point where I just felt like a raisin. Like I had no life left to give. And for me, that was almost the exact same season that Pastor Derek came and spoke to my wife and I, and God began to move us here to Fellowship Community Church, and God really kind of provided a second calling to ministry, because I was pretty done, if I'm honest. Not just in ministry, but in just like business and life. Like I was just... How many of you guys have ever felt that just where you just can't handle another thing, where you just feel like you're about ready to break? That's why we're talking about today, and the title for this sermon is Beating Burnout. Because so many of us have experienced the reality when we don't live a thriving life, it will eventually lead to burnout in some way and somehow. And for us, that's pretty normal, actually. There's a survey in 2021 of U.S. workers, so workers in the United States, more than half of workers feel burnt out as a result of their daily job demands. Expectations just increase, and guess what? We don't get more time, right? And everywhere we turn, people are overwhelmed, they're stressed, they're on the edge of burnout. Now, burnout isn't just working regular or long hours. It's not just exhaustion. It's a combination of mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion from multiple sources. So it's just like an overload of your system. It's generally the inability to balance competing demands. Maybe it's social pressure. Maybe it's financial stress. Maybe it's kids' activities. Like I'm beginning the season of the child Uber season, and from people with older kids, it just gets worse. So the activities side of things, maybe it's caring for aging parents. Maybe it's parents coming back into your home after you have left their home. Stress, that is definitely stressful. Maybe you just work in a stressful work environment, and that's just a reality of the industry you're in. Maybe you just have a level of guilt because of past mistakes or past hurts or past traumas like we talked about, and it just creates a competing demand on your soul in your life. Now, as we've talked about in other times, we've talked about this mental health, if you break your arm, you go to the emergency room, you get it checked out with an x-ray, you get a cast, and everybody's like, oh yeah, that's just what you do with a broken arm. But when you break down emotionally or spiritually, or you get to the point of just utter burnout, and you just can't handle anymore, for many of us, we don't know what to do because we don't want to ask for help. It's stigmatized. It's negative. If you admit you are struggling, then there is something wrong with you. But my hope and my prayer today is that we can talk through what it means for us as Christians to, yes, take this to God and go before God to find a better way. Because stress is going to come. Competing demands are a part of life. But what does it mean for us as followers of Christ to live in that? And so I just want to talk through what is the difference in between just normal everyday stress and burnout. Stress, as you can see on your screen and in your handout, is generally short-lived and related to a temporary project or event. Basically, there's an end in sight. There's stress that's going to something. Burnout, on the other hand, is a chronic stress that feels never-ending. It's the rat race reality where you are just on the treadmill of life and there is no end in sight, and I'm just going to try to endure until the Lord comes or until He kicks me, right? That's that chronic stress. And it can lead to feeling like you don't care. When you have no fight left, when you just feel dead inside, you feel helpless. If you felt those feelings, you're not alone. There's a prophet in the Old Testament named Elijah who would have a lot of those similar realities. He's somebody who went through stress, anxiety, depression, exhaustion, and even burnout. Now, Elijah, just a little bit of his backstory before we get into the scripture for today. Elijah was close to God. He was the man who was known to be the mouthpiece of God to Israel in that time. He was the man that could provide the miracle. If you needed something done from God, Elijah was the man to go see. Now, he was also somebody who took on that prophetic role of confronting the evil of the day. That's a part. Being a prophet is not just speaking truth or doing miracles, but actually addressing the evil of the day. And so he confronted the evil of King Ahab for his sinfulness and his embracing of the idolatry that existed in the country. And so because of Ahab's idolatry and sinfulness, Elijah actually spoke over Israel the fact that there would be a drought. And so it wasn't just a little drought for a month or two, it was a 3-year drought. He told King Ahab it would not rain until he said otherwise. Obviously, this didn't make King Ahab super pleased. When you say something like that to the face of a king, something's going to happen. And so Ahab began to hunt down Elijah. And so for 3 years, God provided bread and meat from ravens. He miraculously provided for Elijah. During this time, he actually raised a child from the dead, the son of a woman who was caring for him. And so this leads up into a moment where he goes to King Ahab and says, the drought is going to be over, but I got a little challenge for you. I want to challenge all of the prophets of the idols of the day. And so he challenges Ahab to bring all of these prophets together and have a competing miracle competition. And so King Ahab brings about 850 prophets. And the challenge is to have 2 different offerings, and whoever brought down the fire of God would win. And the 800 prophets did all of the things that they could do, and they were unable to bring about it. And Elijah, and I don't know if this is just bravado or like God told him to do this, but like he loved to be dramatic and make things a little bit more. And so he had not only had an offering on the altar, but he actually digged a trench around it and drenched it. So it was impossible for it just to light up. And yet the fire of God comes down. And it is an amazing moment where God showed up in a competition of who's the strongest and mightiest. And Elijah was the person who saw it and was used in that moment. And the 850 prophets, after showing the defeat, they actually lost their life as a consequence of their idolatry. So we see this moment where Elijah, it's got to be on like a mountaintop. Like, this is awesome, right? Like the whole nation of Israel was invited to this competition to see. But as soon as King Ahab returned to his home, his wife Jezebel, who was really the source of the majority of the idolatry and pushing this on the Israelite people, she becomes mad for a couple reasons. One, her gods have been shown up. Nobody likes that. Her prophets were shown to be ineffective, and they actually lost their life. So 850 people who were under her care or under her responsibility lost their life. And so she becomes incredibly angry and makes a threat against Elijah that by the next day he would lose his life. Now, when a queen makes a threat, that's pretty significant, right? But Elijah had experienced nonstop protection from God up to this point. His provision, his presence, God's power to overcome the 850 prophets of the pagan prophets. And then one irritated woman makes a threat. And guess what happens to Elijah? He falls apart. Now, there's no evidence that Jezebel sent any armies, which guess what? King Ahab actually sent an army to pursue him. Jezebel takes no action to fulfill this threat in the biblical account. She doesn't hire mercenaries. She doesn't send ninjas after him. And yet, Elijah is full of fear. Ever have that moment when you just can't handle one more thing? This is what is happening to this prophet. He cannot handle one more thing going on in his life. It's the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, how does the body respond to stress in our own life? We can see this in Elijah here in a minute. But how does that happen? How does stress slowly move to burnout? And it manifests itself in 3 ways: physical, mental, and emotional. Physically, it affects you in a way that you're easily fatigued. You're constantly have low energy. It's difficult to sleep. You have headaches. You have body aches. You're just in intense muscle pain for the physical trauma of burnout, when you're at burnout. Now, it will eventually lead to some coping mechanism, some way to deal with this reality of the stress going to burnout. You'll eventually change your eating habits. You'll maybe have pursue abusing alcohol or prescription drugs that you have for pain management, going a little bit further and a little further to cope. It makes sense when we have to cope with the reality of stress overcoming us. It can affect you mentally. Ongoing stress actually impacts your brain. As we've talked about before, it can actually change the chemistry of the way that your mind works. It causes your fight and flight to be constantly engaged. So if anything happens, you're automatically going to the worst case scenario of fighting, desperation. And if the stress continues to grow, it actually shrinks or weakens your prefrontal cortex. So your ability to make decisions is actually impacted. So you actually become more indecisive. You lose some of your memory ability. You have a difficulty of focus. These are actual physical or mental things that can impact you when stress becomes burnout. Then finally, emotional. This can be maybe the hardest to admit. When stress moves to burnout, you begin to lose motivation. You can have a chronic feeling of self-doubt. It's not like one thing is a failure, you are a failure. It's not like you messed up, but you are a mess up. You become miserable in whatever you are in the midst of. If that be your job, if it be your marriage, if it just be life in general, you just eventually become cynical and bitter, disconnected from God, and maybe even blaming God. Now, I didn't have all of that in my own life, but I definitely had some of it. But there's somebody who actually had all of that feeling, and that was Elijah. We see it in his story where it impacts him. But how did he get to that point? I think if we look at his own journey, we might be able to see some of ourselves in this journey of stress overcoming us to the point of burnout. And the first mistake Elijah made is the fact that we run ourselves into the ground, just like Elijah did. We try to do too much. 1 Kings 19:3 tells us Elijah was afraid and he ran for his life. He was overcome by the fear of what Jezebel would do. And he didn't just run to the wilderness near the town. He ran to Beersheba. And if you look on the map, it's that red dotted line, and then he'll eventually go down all the way to the bottom. That is the very bottom of the southern kingdom of Israel. He went as far as he possibly could go to get away. It was over 100 miles, the southernmost limit of Judah. I don't know about you, have you ever had those moments where you're just trying to do it all? If I could say, this journey is Elijah's attempt to protect himself instead of being dependent upon God. He's running. He's trying to do it himself. I don't know if it's for you, if it's trying to achieve the college grades that you need to feel like you have the ability. Try to do whatever the work is to accomplish the future job that you desire. Maybe you're just trying to hold everything together for those that you love that are around you, and you just can't do it for everybody. But if you don't do it, you're afraid it's all going to fall apart. Maybe you're just trying to be a good mom, however you define that, or to be a good dad, or just simply pay the bills. That can be stressful in and of itself, just to get through the things of life. But we all have those activities that can just drive us from the stress of life to a state of burnout. The second thing that Elijah did that I think we do as well is that we try to do it all on our own. We've talked about this throughout this series as we talk about mental health or really trauma or struggles. So often, these moments draw us towards isolation when we need community the most. We are so raw and in pain that we seek to protect ourselves in isolation. And we see in chapter 19, continuing verse 3, when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. He went on alone. We do that so often. We feel like we can't tell other people because we'll be embarrassed. We're too proud to ask for help. We don't know who to trust. We don't know how to trust. And so we, once again, hide in isolation. The third thing is that we dwell on the negative. You had enough. You feel like you have failed. And guess what? When you dwell on the negatives, when you put the negative glasses on, it is all you're going to see. As I think Pastor Josh talked about last week, when you buy a new car and you're so thrilled about whatever the car is, it's the only car that you see, and all of them are your color, and you're no longer special, right? But when you put on those glasses, it is all you are able to see. And that's exactly what happened to Elijah, as described in verse 4, where he got to the point where he is actually telling God, "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." He's gotten to the point of comparison. I'm not sure if you've gotten to that negative place where everyone is doing something better than you. If that be your marriage, if that be finances, you only see your debt and you see everyone's vacations on Instagram. Maybe you just realize you can't get it all done, and happiness is just impossible because of everything going on in your life. You've had enough, and it's not worth it anymore. This is a prophet of God who is in the exact same place. Because in Elijah's darkest moment, God came to him. And he's coming to you. And he's coming to me. And it says in verse 5, all at once an angel touched him and said, pause right there. What do you think the angel says? Do you think the angel said, "Man, you are a loser. What are you doing hiding out in the wilderness as far as you possibly can? Don't you think I can protect you?" Do you think the angel called him out for his sin and his lack of faith and his abandoning his servant? No. The angel says this. This is super practical. He says, "Get up and eat." Elijah looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate, drank, and then laid back down. So the angel simply says, "Get up, eat, and take a nap." Amen. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is rest. Now, rest can look a little bit different. It could be just going out and taking a day off work. It could be going out and eating a donut. It could be just taking a nap. It could be going out and eating a protein bar. If you're super fancy, going for that avocado toast with the matcha green tea, that's your spot, right? But so much holds us back from just resting with the Lord. And more often than not, it's some level of false guilt. Some thought that you have to be the solution. You have to do more. You have to be more. You have to be enough for whatever the situation may be. But so often, it's this instance where you're allowing your mind to bully your body because your body is physically telling you you need a break. You need a rest. You need a day off. You need to rest in the Lord. Now, it can look a little bit something different. As I reflect on my own transition from very much a ministry reality where there was a lot of good, and I'm not trying to say it was all negative, but man, I was drained, and I was questioning my call to ministry. I was questioning why in the world did God call us to Florida to not win? And the last 6 years has been striving and failing more than winning probably, but to find a healthy spiritual life, to find a way in which I connect with God. And for me, I'm weird. If I know I am at an empty spot and I just need time with the Lord, I go to, and don't steal this, I'm just kidding. I go to St. Leo. There's an abbey there. It is a beautiful church, and there's a college there with campus. It is a beautiful place to be with God. But for me, in my personality, I'm an achiever. I love getting things done. Like I've said before, to-do list is a sacred thing in my life, and it's probably a bad thing, but I have to accomplish. So for me to rest in God, I have to actually mentally choose to say, I am going to waste time with Jesus. Literally waste time with Him. Choose a day off where I do not desire to accomplish anything. I am just with God. And for me, many times I have to go to a place like St. Leo. I have to walk around. I have to go and spend time. And I go get some ponchos and come home having been so filled up with the Lord. Because that's what I found for me. Because we need to be able to find space to find rest in Sabbath. In the Old Testament, it talks, and even Jesus talks about Sabbath, resting, and actually being with God. And yes, that's a part of not working and a part of coming together in the church, but it's also just finding space to enjoy God. And it comes out in different ways for different people. If you work with your mind, maybe you need to disengage your mind and engage your body, and that can be your rest. Maybe that means going and mowing the lawn, which sometimes I hate to start, but once I get going, I love it, because that same reality. Maybe you need to go clear that bush out. Maybe you need to go build something, get into woodworking, get into build like something that you can accomplish with your body. But if you work with your body and have a physical reality, maybe you just need to rest. Maybe you need to go find a beach and get a hammock and chillax. Maybe you need to get your headphones and go to your lanai and just enjoy some worship music and just rest. Whatever you might need today, I challenge you to find a different rhythm. Find a way to rest with God, to encounter Him. Because you can do all of the things you want and accomplish everything you could ever want. But if you are in the midst of that struggle of stress, becoming burnout, or even just exhaustion in your faith or in your life, you don't just need a vacation. More times than not, you come back more exhausted from vacation than you left, but that's a whole other conversation. You need to encounter God, however that works for you. And yes, that can happen at church on Sunday morning, but it can also happen at whatever morning you create. It could be you could be weird like me that likes to go to old churches and just rest with the Lord. You could be one of those people who loves to go into nature. I want to be a nature person so bad. Like I just want to go on a kayak and just hear from Jesus. But for some reason it just doesn't work for me. Like I go out there and I just focus on the mosquitoes and get distracted, and it's just, I'm going to keep trying. But whatever it is for you, maybe you just need to take a day off and go golfing. Just enjoy that. Maybe it's sewing. You need to finish that quilt and just rest in the Lord and be with the Lord in that. I don't know what it might be. But do it with an intention. But God called Elijah all the way down to Mount Horeb for an encounter with Him. And this is what happens in verse 11. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake. but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. The Lord was in the gentle whisper. He wasn't in the extravagant or extraordinary. He was in the ordinary. So much of my life, I felt like this was a lesson that God is hard to hear. Because if it was in the extraordinary, the dramatic, man, He would be really easy to understand. But I think a better understanding is that God is in the whisper because God is always close. God is always nearby. So God can speak to you in the ordinary. God can speak to you in the quiet moments of the morning as you get your coffee ready. God can speak to you while you're folding laundry, when you're changing diapers, or if you have young kids, that wonderful season where you're just trying to survive the night because that kid will not go down. Or maybe it could be just loving a difficult person at work. As the worship team comes forward, I just want to help you to see that truth, that God is near us. He whispers. And it's that truth that when we pay attention, when we come with a purpose, we will be so impressed and surprised at how often the Lord will come into that moment. It might not always be the way that we expect, because guess what? Elijah expected the dramatic. He just saw God show up in a competition of divinity, right? Who has the power? He's the one who showed up and saw a dead child come to life, and yet in the moment, Elijah didn't need the dramatic, he needed the personal. And maybe you have that same need today. I think Jesus made an invitation for us in Matthew 11 that I think speaks directly to us. Are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythm of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Man, doesn't that sound amazing? Freely and lightly. Not crushed by our own anxieties, sinking in our negativities, focusing on the hurt and negativity of our life, the betrayal, the abuse, the heartbreaking reality. No. When we walk with Jesus, the stresses of life don't eventually always lead into a burnout of giving up, but can draw us into the presence of God, to draw us close to Jesus. So let me encourage you. If you're at that point of stress becoming burnout, or you just are realizing, man, I feel so spiritually empty. I feel so emotionally empty. I feel so physically empty. I think the answer is always be with Jesus. Rest with Him. So maybe you need to go mow the yard with some intention of hearing from God. Maybe you need to go for a walk, go to the beach, find some kayaks, go be in nature, or go be one of those crazy people. Maybe you just need to create space to hear God in your daily life. But I want to ask a question. How many of you would say that you are in a moment where stress is on its way or is in burnout? If that's you, raise your hand. You're not alone. The prophet of God was in the exact same place. But the question I ask you is, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to just continue on this week? Or are you going to do something, maybe even this afternoon, where you intentionally rest in the Lord? I encourage you to think of a specific activity that you can do with Jesus as we worship the Lord today.
This is